The first time my husband smiled during the divorce proceedings was the moment I knew I'd already won. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't relief. It was satisfaction. The kind of quiet, self-assured satisfaction of a man who believed he had just taken everything from the woman sitting across from him. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something I couldn't hear. My husband, Daniel, gave a small nod, eyes flicking toward me for just a second longer than necessary. Long enough to make sure I saw it. Long enough to make sure I understood. He thought I was finished, and I suppose, from the outside, it looked that way. I sat there in the Federal Circuit Court in Sydney, hands folded neatly in my lap, posture straight, expression calm. I wore the same neutral-toned dress I'd chosen carefully that morning. Nothing too sharp, nothing too soft. Invisible. Forgettable. That had always been my role in Daniel's life. Supportive, quiet, convenient, replaceable. His lawyer began outlining the proposed settlement again, voice smooth, confident, almost rehearsed. Assets, liabilities, property divisions. Words that should have felt heavy, final, devastating. Instead, they felt distant, almost irrelevant, because every single thing they were fighting so hard to take from me, I had already let go of years ago. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I met Daniel 12 years ago, long before courtrooms and contracts and quiet wars fought through paperwork. Back then, Sydney felt bigger, brighter, full of possibility in a way that only exists when you still believe your life is about to begin. I was 26, working in a mid-level administrative role for a logistics company near Parramatta. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, predictable, safe. Daniel was the opposite. He walked into my life like someone who had never doubted himself for a single second. Confident, charming, effortlessly persuasive. He worked in finance, though I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. Something about investments, property, leveraging opportunities. Words that sounded impressive, even if I couldn't quite follow the mechanics behind them. What I did understand was how he made me feel. Seen, important, chosen. He noticed things, the way I organized my desk, the fact that I always ordered the same coffee, the way I hesitated before speaking in group settings, as if weighing whether my opinion mattered. To him, it did. Or at least, that's what he made me believe. Our relationship moved quickly. Within a year, we were living together in a modern apartment overlooking the city. His apartment, though he always referred to it as ours. Within 2 years, we were married in a small but elegant ceremony on the northern beaches. Looking back, there were signs even then, small ones, easy to dismiss. Daniel liked control, not in an obvious, aggressive way, but in subtle, almost invisible ways that felt reasonable at the time. He preferred handling the finances because he was better with numbers. He suggested I cut back my work hours because there was no need for both of us to be stressed. He encouraged me to trust him with the bigger picture. And I did, because that's what you do when you believe you're building a life with someone. You trust them. You hand over pieces of yourself, assuming they'll protect them. At first, everything seemed to grow. We upgraded apartments, then bought a house. Daniel talked about investments constantly, property deals, opportunities, leveraging equity. There was always something in motion, always a sense that we were building something bigger than what we had. A future, security, freedom, or at least, that's how he framed it. My role became quieter over time. I left my job entirely after our second year of marriage. It made sense, financially, or so Daniel explained. His income was more than enough, and he reassured me that everything we owned was for us, for our future. I handled the home, the schedules, the details of daily life that kept everything running smoothly behind the scenes. And for a while, I was happy, or maybe just comfortable. It's hard to tell the difference when nothing is actively going wrong. The first crack didn't come from another woman. It came from a spreadsheet. I remember the exact moment because it felt so insignificant at the time. Daniel had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he took a call. I wasn't snooping. I had no reason to. I was just cleaning up, but the screen caught my eye. Numbers, columns, rows. At first glance, it looked like any other financial document. something I'd seen variations of before without really paying attention. But something about this one felt different, messier, less polished. There were figures highlighted in red, large ones, and next to them, terms I didn't recognize: shortfalls, liabilities, interest exposure. I stared at it longer than I should have, not because I understood it, but because I didn't. And that was new. Daniel had always made things sound simple, controlled, intentional. This didn't look controlled. It looked unstable. He walked back into the room before I could process it properly, and the way he reacted told me everything I needed to know. He didn't ask what I was doing, he didn't laugh it off. He closed the laptop, immediately, too quickly. "It's nothing," he said, voice light but firm. "Just projections. You wouldn't understand. It's complicated." And just like that, the moment passed, or at least that's how it looked on the surface. But something had shifted, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. For the first time in years, I felt like there was something in my life I wasn't supposed to see, something being managed, hidden. And I didn't push, not right away, because part of me didn't want to know. It's easier to stay comfortable in a life that feels secure than to start pulling at threads that might unravel everything. So I let it go, at least outwardly. But once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. The questions don't disappear. They settle. They wait. And then, slowly, they start to grow. I began noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way Daniel avoided specifics when talking about money. The way conversations would shift if I asked too many questions. The increasing frequency of late-night calls he took in another room. None of it was obvious enough to confront. But together, it formed a pattern. And patterns are hard to ignore. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. Instead, I did something Daniel had never expected me to do. I started paying attention, quietly, carefully, patiently. And what I eventually found wasn't just a small inconsistency. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even a mistake. It was something much bigger, something that would have destroyed me if I hadn't discovered it when I did. Across the courtroom, Daniel shifted in his seat, his expression still calm, still confident, still certain. He thought this was the end of the story. The moment where he walked away with everything we had built and left me with nothing. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly realize, was that the story he was so eager to finish had actually started years ago. And I had been writing the ending ever since. If you had asked me back then whether Daniel controlled my life, I would have laughed. Not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't feel like control. It felt like guidance, stability, certainty. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't issue demands. He didn't need to. He just positioned himself as the one who knew better. And over time, I stopped questioning it. I started with small adjustments. "Let me handle that," he'd say whenever bills came up. Or, "It's easier if everything runs through one account." At first, it made sense. He worked in finance. Numbers were his world. Mine weren't. I told myself I was lucky. Most people worried about money. I didn't have to. Daniel made sure of that. But not worrying slowly turned into not knowing. And not knowing became something else entirely. By the 4th year of our marriage, I couldn't have told you exactly how much we owned or how much we owed. I just knew what Daniel told me. We're doing well. We're expanding. It's all under control. Those phrases became the foundation of my understanding. And I built my sense of security on top of them without realizing how fragile they actually were. It wasn't just finances, it was everything. Daniel had opinions about where we went, who we saw, how we spent our time. Again, never forceful, never obvious, just consistent. If I suggested dinner with friends, he'd gently remind me how busy things were. If I mentioned going back to work, he'd point out how unnecessary it was and how stressful it might be. If I hesitated, he'd reassure me in a way that made disagreement feel unreasonable. "You don't need to worry about those things," he'd say, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear like it was a kindness. "That's what I'm here for." And I believed him, because believing him was easier than pushing back. The isolation didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened gradually, quietly, until one day I realized my world had become very small, centered almost entirely around him. My best friend, Sophie, was one of the few constants that remained. We'd known each other since our early 20s, before Daniel, before the house, before the carefully structured life I now lived. Sophie was different from me, more direct, more willing to question things. She saw through people quickly in a way I never quite could, which is probably why she never fully trusted Daniel. "You're happy, right?" she asked me once, casually, over coffee in a small cafe tucked away from the city noise. It should have been an easy question. It wasn't. "Of course," I said, a little too quickly. Sophie didn't respond immediately. She just watched me for a moment, like she was waiting for something else. "You don't work anymore, you barely come out. And every time I ask you about anything serious, you repeat something you said instead of what you think." I felt a flicker of irritation, or maybe defensiveness. "That's not fair," I said. "We're building something together. It just looks different." Sophie leaned back slightly, studying me. "Okay," she said gently. "Just don't lose yourself in the process." I smiled, brushed it off, changed the subject, because again, it was easier. Daniel, of course, had opinions about Sophie. Nothing harsh, just subtle observations. "She doesn't really understand how things work at our level. She means well, but she's a bit reactive. You don't need that kind of negativity." He never told me to stop seeing her. He didn't have to. Over time, I just saw her less. Then there was his mother, Margaret. If Daniel's control was subtle, Margaret's was not. She had a way of entering a room like she already owned it. Chin slightly raised, eyes scanning, assessing. From the beginning, she made it clear I wasn't quite what she would have chosen for her son. "She's very simple," I once overheard her say, not quietly enough during an early family dinner. Daniel didn't correct her. He just squeezed my hand under the table, as if that made it better. Margaret's presence in our lives grew over time. She visited often, unannounced sometimes, commenting on the house, the way I dressed, the way I hosted. "Daniel works very hard," she would say, glancing around like she was inspecting something. It's important his environment reflects that. I learned quickly that reflecting that meant aligning with her expectations. Everything had to be just right, or at least acceptable. The dynamic between them fascinated me. Daniel was confident with everyone else, but around his mother, there was something different, a need to impress, to prove, to maintain an image, and that image, I began to realize, extended to our marriage. By year 6, the life we had built looked perfect from the outside, a beautiful home in a quiet Sydney suburb. Financial success, at least that's how it appeared. A marriage that seemed stable, even enviable. But inside that life, things were shifting. The late nights became more frequent. At first it was work, big deals, important clients, time-sensitive opportunities. Then it became less defined. Just things I need to handle. He stopped explaining, and I stopped asking. There were other changes too, subtle ones. He became more distant, less present. Conversations grew shorter, more transactional. Affection turned into routine, predictable, empty. And then there were the phone calls. Always taken in another room, always quiet, always just out of reach. I remember one night in particular. It was late, past midnight. I had woken up and noticed Daniel wasn't in bed. The house was silent except for the faint murmur of his voice drifting down the hallway. I didn't mean to listen, but I did. "No, she doesn't know," he said, tone low, controlled. "And she's not going to." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "Trust me, I've got it handled." Something cold settled in my chest. Not panic, not yet, just awareness. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that whispers. The next morning, everything was normal. Breakfast, coffee, casual conversation. Like nothing had happened, like I hadn't heard anything at all. And I played my part, because by then, I understood something important. Daniel didn't just prefer control, he relied on it. On people not asking questions, on things staying exactly as he presented them. And for the first time, I stopped being the person who accepted that version of reality without question. I didn't confront him, I didn't accuse him, I didn't change my behavior in any obvious way. Instead, I adjusted quietly, the same way he always had. I started paying closer attention to everything. Not just the finances, but the patterns, the inconsistencies, the moments that didn't quite add up, and slowly, very slowly, the life I thought I understood began to look different. Less stable, less certain, more constructed. Sophie noticed the shift before anyone else. "You've gone quiet," she said one afternoon, watching me carefully. "But not in the same way as before." I smiled slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, leaning forward, "you're thinking now. Really thinking. And I don't think Daniel knows that yet." I held her gaze for a moment. "No," I said softly. "He doesn't." Across the room, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Running late. Don't wait up." I looked at it for a second longer than necessary, then locked the screen, because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for him anymore. And he had no idea. By the time I realized what Daniel had been hiding, the cracks in our life were no longer subtle. They were gaping chasms. It started with a text message I wasn't supposed to see. I was walking past his study, late evening, when his laptop screen glowed faintly through the slightly open door. My name twitched at the edge of my mind, a warning I chose to ignore. Curiosity got the better of me. I slid the door wider, just enough to see a fragment of an email on the screen. "Had a wonderful time tonight. Can't wait to see you again. X." My stomach dropped. It wasn't the kind of message a husband sends to his wife. It wasn't a work email. It wasn't some casual joke. It was unmistakable. For a moment, I froze. Then came the anger, the betrayal, the disbelief. I wanted to scream, to confront him, to make him pay for what he had done. But the words stayed locked in my throat. Because I remembered something else. The quiet whispers of my own investigation, months, years ago, when I'd stumbled upon Daniel's financial truth. The grand assets he flaunted, not assets at all. Massive, suffocating debt. Hidden loans, lines of credit, investments gone sour. All signed in our names. And all meant to look like wealth to anyone watching. He hadn't just been cheating emotionally, he'd been building a trap. A life that looked enviable, but was really a cage. That night I watched him walk in like nothing had happened. His cologne hit me first, then his casual smile. I could see the faint shimmer of guilt in his eyes, quickly masked by charm. "Hey, love," he said, leaning down to kiss me. "Late night at work, huh?" I smiled tightly, masking the storm inside me. "Yes," I said softly. "Just catching up on emails." He didn't notice anything. Not the tightness in my hands, not the way my eyes followed his every move, not the knowledge that I now held all the cards. The next week was a masterclass in humiliation. Daniel began to push his control harder. He demanded that I sign papers. He insisted that I hand over accounts, passwords, even access to our personal investments. "You don't need to worry about it," he said, echoing his favorite line. "It's easier if I handle things." And as he flaunted his supposed wealth at dinner parties, business lunches, even casual meetups with family. I let him. I smiled, nodded, admired the way he carried himself, the way his colleagues bowed to him. On the outside, I was the perfect, supportive wife. Inside, I was laughing at the sheer audacity of it all. Because every dollar he thought he had, every asset he paraded, it was a lie. I had kept meticulous records, hidden folders, spreadsheets, emails, and statements. I knew exactly how deep the debt went, how fragile his empire was. The day he demanded the house, the cars, the accounts, I simply nodded. "Of course," I said, voice calm, almost serene. Take it all. His eyes widened, just for a flicker, before he masked it with smug satisfaction. Are you sure? He asked. You'll be left with nothing. Yes, I said softly, almost dreamlike. Everything is yours. He laughed, leaning back in his chair. Victory, triumph, that look of a man who believes he's won. I watched him make the calls, sign the papers, celebrate the supposed windfall with colleagues, post about it on social media. The humiliation wasn't mine, it was his. Every dinner, every glance, every congratulatory handshake reminded him that he had won. And yet, beneath that pride, his empire was crumbling. Months passed. Daniel had no idea. No idea that the business he had boasted about was sinking, that the luxury car he drove, leased, overdue, with penalties stacking quietly in the background, that the so-called investment properties, bankruptcy waiting silently in the wings. He had everything he wanted, and it was nothing. At a particularly lavish dinner at his company's Sydney office, he raised a toast to his success. To wealth, power, and the thrill of the game. I clinked my glass with his, smiling so brightly that colleagues mistook it for admiration. Inside, I was counting the days until the debt notices arrived, the lawsuits, the angry creditors, the bank calls that would strip him of every illusion he had built. And I couldn't help but feel a quiet, sweet satisfaction at the impending collapse. Because this wasn't revenge through confrontation. This was justice. And it was perfect. That night, when the first calls came in, urgent, panicked, angry, I was sitting in the same house he had demanded. In the quiet of what used to be our living room. He came running in, phone pressed to his ear, face pale. Eva, I don't understand. How could this happen? Everything was supposed to be mine. I sipped my tea, calm, gentle, almost maternal. I told you, I said softly, everything is yours. He looked around, desperate, as the weight of the debt finally crushed him. The realization hit him slowly, painfully, like a wave rolling in over rocks, relentless and unforgiving. He had lost, and I had won without lifting a finger. I stayed, watching as the life he had built for show collapsed in real time. The humiliation, the panic, the anger, it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt free. What no one knew, least of all Daniel, was that my apparent weakness, my quiet compliance, had been a carefully honed act. Years before, when we were still building our life together in Sydney, I stumbled across something that should have terrified me. At first, it was subtle. A bank statement left on the kitchen counter, an investment report shoved under his laptop, then a casual comment he made about leveraging assets that didn't quite add up. My curiosity piqued, I started digging. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The assets he flaunted, the properties, the investments, the fancy cars, the lavish lifestyle, they weren't his. Not really. They were illusions. Debt piled upon debt. Hidden loans with sky-high interest rates. Investment ventures that had long since failed, signed in our names, deliberately structured to protect him while leaving me exposed. If only I knew. I couldn't confront him then. Not yet. I needed patience. I needed a plan. So I watched. I waited. I played the part of the doting wife, quietly noting every transaction, every misstep, every moment of arrogance that would one day serve me well. When he began to show his true self, the arrogance, the controlling behavior, the cruel dismissiveness, I didn't react. I let him escalate. I let him tighten his grip on what he thought was his empire, believing that I was powerless. I was acting weak on purpose. And I wanted him to think he had me cornered, that I would never fight back. Every heated argument, every condescending remark, every attempt to control me financially or emotionally only reinforced my plan. I even involved the right people in my background research. Financial advisors I trusted, legal experts I could quietly consult. I kept detailed spreadsheets, records of every loan, every debt, every hidden liability. I knew exactly how fragile Daniel's empire was, and I knew exactly how to let him take it all, while making him believe it was a victory. I also planted a few small, seemingly innocuous clues that hinted at my naivety. The time I forgot to check a bank statement before he bragged about his latest acquisition. The day I accidentally left my laptop open while he gloated about our investments. Even my friends and family were in on the act, subtly reinforcing his belief that I was completely dependent on him. It was all part of a delicate dance. The divorce proceedings became the final act of my plan. When he demanded everything, our house, the cars, the investments, even the modest savings I had quietly tucked away, I agreed. Take it all, I said calmly with a serene smile that hid years of careful preparation. He laughed, exultant, believing he had won. I've worked hard for this, he said, voice brimming with smug satisfaction. Finally, it's all mine. Yes, I said, almost dreamlike. Everything is yours. Little did he know, the empire he thought he was inheriting was nothing more than a mirage. The debts would crush him, the creditors would come calling, the lawsuits would strip him of every illusion he had ever built. And I would remain untouched, watching as the man who thought he had conquered me fell into the trap I had laid years ago. Every conversation, every courtroom meeting, every handshake with lawyers and mediators was a performance. I smiled, I nodded. I appeared vulnerable, dependent, even afraid. And every time he gloated, I felt a quiet thrill. Because my secret was simple. I had already won. I had prepared. I had waited. I had acted weak on purpose. And now all that remained was to let the law, and the weight of reality, do the rest. The stage was set. The plan was perfect. And Daniel had no idea that the victory he was celebrating was actually the beginning of his undoing. The day of the final hearing in the Sydney family court arrived like a storm. Outside, the harbor shimmered under a pale autumn sun, but inside, the air was thick with tension. I sat calmly, hands folded, dressed in a soft gray suit that masked nothing of my resolve. Daniel, as always, looked triumphant, his chest puffed up, smug grin plastered across his face, believing today would cement his total victory. He had brought every document, every boastful claim, every imagined proof of wealth. Lawyers leaned in, whispering strategies, but I barely noticed. I had long stopped needing to fight in the conventional sense. My strategy had been set years ago. When the judge called the case, Daniel went first, launching into a confident, rehearsed speech about my supposed dependence, my lack of understanding of finances, my alleged irresponsibility. Each sentence dripped with arrogance, the kind only a man who believes himself untouchable can muster. I sat silently, letting it wash over me. His words, meant to intimidate, fueled the quiet smile on my lips. Then it was my turn. I rose, voice calm and measured, letting the courtroom absorb every word. Your Honor, I began, everything my ex-husband claims as assets is not what it seems. In fact, much of what he presents as wealth is massive hidden debt, cleverly disguised. I have evidence. A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel's confident grin faltered ever so slightly. I handed the documents to my lawyer, who passed them to the judge. They were meticulous. Bank statements, loan agreements, investment failures, legal notices from creditors. Every detail carefully logged over years of preparation. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's face drained of color as he flipped through the papers, muttering, "That's not possible. No, this can't be. Where? How?" He had never expected this. Never imagined that the woman he had treated as weak, submissive, and dependent had been quietly preparing, quietly building her case for years. This changes everything," his lawyer stammered, realizing the gravity of the documents. The judge's expression was unreadable, but the words that followed were clear and devastating. "Mr. Harrison, these are substantial debts, hidden liabilities. What you considered assets are, in fact, obligations that must be addressed. The court cannot grant you sole ownership of what is effectively insolvency." Daniel's world collapsed in that courtroom, all of his arrogance and entitlement crumbling before the cold, precise weight of reality. He tried to argue, to twist, to blame, but it was too late. The documents were irrefutable. The years of careful planning, quiet observation, and subtle preparation had brought the scales of justice to balance. I remained calm throughout, voice steady when I addressed the court once more. I allowed him to believe he had won. I let him take it all. But the truth is, there was never anything to take. I wanted him to expose himself, to reveal his true character. Today, that truth is undeniable. The courtroom absorbed the finality in my words. Daniel slumped into his chair, finally seeing the consequences of his greed and betrayal. Outside, the media whispered, but I ignored them. I had no desire for public revenge. I had never needed it. My victory was quiet, powerful, and absolute. Daniel's empire, built on lies and hidden debts, began to unravel. Creditors called. Lawsuits were filed. The lavish cars were repossessed. The investments collapsed. The properties were seized. And I walked away free. I returned to my apartment overlooking Sydney Harbor, where the city sparkled like tiny diamonds under the fading sun. I poured myself a cup of tea, the warmth grounding me. I finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. No anger, no bitterness, only relief, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had outsmarted a man who had underestimated me at every turn. I had been patient, I had been strategic, and now I was free. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a serene rhythm. Friends visited, laughter returned to my home, and I could finally make decisions without fear or manipulation. The weight of hidden secrets, deceit, and false control was gone. Daniel? He faded from my life like a shadow, a cautionary tale whispered among mutual acquaintances. He had lost everything: wealth, respect, control, and most importantly, the illusion of power over me. I had gained far more than I could have imagined: peace, independence, and the knowledge that true strength often lies in patience, observation, and cunning. As I looked out over the harbor one evening, the sun setting in hues of gold and rose, I realized the simple truth. Sometimes the greatest justice is not loud or vindictive. It is quiet, it is methodical, and it is inevitable. Daniel had believed he could break me, take everything, and come out unscathed. He was wrong. And I had everything I truly needed: calm, powerful, and free.